In Imperial China, entering the Imperial Palace was a one-way door. You didn't choose to go in, and you rarely got to choose what happened after. But nothing made that clearer than the moment the Emperor died. Once he stopped breathing, there was a strong possibility that soon, you would too. Stay tuned for a first-person account from a survivor of one of these incidents. Welcome back to The Rose's Past. I'm Rose, and I cover deep dives into history and the lives of the past. And today we're going to be traveling throughout ancient China in search of the answer to an unfortunate reality for thousands of women. What happened to imperial concubines after the emperor died? The answer changed across centuries, and at its worst, it was far darker than the official record ever wanted you to know. But before we go anywhere, we need to answer the obvious question in the room. Why were these women's fates tied to the emperor's death at all? Three forces kept driving the answer in different combinations across every dynasty that we're going to cover today. First was a spiritual belief that the emperor's household didn't end when he died. It just moved underground. Second was dynastic anxiety. It was the motivation because surviving consorts might be used by their families to gain power. And third, eventually social reframing on what a woman's virtue means and how it should be maintained. But under all of that was simply one thing: control. Some of the earliest victims of this practice were found in an ancient tomb from over 3,000 years ago. The Shang Dynasty tomb of a woman named Lady Fu Hao, a military general and priestess, and top consort to the king Wu Ding. Alongside her jade and bronze, and her cowrie shells, they discovered at least 16 beheaded human skeletons. These were her attendants that were buried to serve her in the afterlife. She has her own dedicated video linked above, but what her tomb tells us today is pretty simple. This practice was already ancient by the time she died. It was a practice called xunzhang, or funerary sacrifice. And it wasn't clear or standardized across any of these dynasties. Records describe everything from live burials, executions, to forced suicide by poison or hanging. The system swallowed servants, attendants, officials, and concubines alike. The primary empress was generally the only person exempt from this fate, but everyone below her rank was not. The Zhou dynasty continued this morbid tradition, and when the ruler Qin Wukong died, 177 people were sent with him to the grave. The texts from that time record a very high level of moral outrage, which tells us something important about society at the time. Even though the practice was continuing, the people inside of that world were already starting to question it. Moving on to 2,247 years ago, Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor and the man who unified the country, actually tried to move away from human sacrifice. We know this because he built the terracotta army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, and officials, each intricately painted and buried to serve him symbolically in his afterlife. That was a deliberate, conscious decision for a replacement for the real thing. And then the emperor died, and his successor, Qin Ershi, undid his wishes within weeks. He went on to order all of his father's childless concubines to accompany him in death. And in a darker twist, even the artisans who built the mausoleum were allegedly sealed inside alive to protect its secrets. We'll never fully know why his son reversed his last wishes, but that question should sit with you. When the Han Dynasty finally arrived, we start to see movement in the right direction. Confucian scholars were making the moral argument that human sacrifice was a barbaric practice that was incompatible with human governance. And one of China's best preserved tombs, the tomb of Lady Dai, was filled with 162 carved wooden figurines called Mingqi, or spirit objects. These represented her household staff, including musicians, mourners, and servants, intended to serve her forever. The archaeology and the ideology were finally moving together for once. The Han government also started punishing rulers who tried to keep the old ways alive. Anyone caught practicing human sacrifice had their families stripped of their titles and territories. So, now we need to ask, if the women weren't being killed, what exactly was happening to them? That would be confinement. Lifelong, permanent confinement. Women who outlived their emperor were kept in designated areas of the palace. They were cared for still, but forbidden from ever remarrying and denied from ever leaving. And that model became the template every other dynasty followed from then on. But before we get to our next big dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, we need to stop at a dynasty that invented something so twisted it almost defies belief. The Northern Wei dynasty had a formal written policy called 子贵母死, meaning when the son is honored, the mother dies. Imagine that. Something that most other women were rewarded for in this dynasty was also your death sentence. A woman named Lady Liu learned this firsthand. When her son, Tobasu, was designated as crown prince, she was ordered to take her own life by poisoning or hanging. She never even saw him take the throne. By the time the Sui and Tang dynasties came around, religious seclusion in monasteries and palace seclusion were both being used. Two paths to choose from, but both of them still permanent. The monastery option sounds merciful by comparison, and in some ways it was. But life as a nun meant strict discipline, lifelong celibacy, complete isolation from family and past friends. Most former concubines who went this route lived quietly, with their identities and former status gradually forgotten over the years. But there's one famous exception that escaped that punishment, and her name is Wu Zetian. She started as a low-ranking concubine to the Emperor Taizong, but was sent to a Buddhist nunnery when he died. But fate would have it that she would walk back out someday. Now, it's important to remember that her return only happened because Taizong's son became infatuated with her. Without that specific reason, she would have disappeared into the same silence as everyone else. For every Wu Zetian, there were thousands of women who entered that nunnery and never came out again. Then comes the Song Dynasty, and the social shift that did more sustained damage to a woman's lives than any single emperor's decree. Neo-Confucianism was in full swing, and it transformed the chastity of a widow from social expectation to a moral absolute. A widow who remarried wasn't just seen as unconventional, she was morally compromised, seen publicly as a failure, and lifelong confinement stopped being just a political management tool and got reframed as virtue protection instead. And here's where the story takes a turn that you probably weren't expecting. After centuries of moving away from funerary human sacrifice, the Ming Dynasty went and brought it all back again. But to understand why, you need to understand exactly where the Ming came from. The dynasty it replaced was the Yuan dynasty, and that dynasty was a Mongol-ruled China. The Mongol customs around death operated from an entirely different framework, with different traditions and very different logic behind them. When Zhu Yuanzhang overthrew the Yuan and founded the Ming in 1368, he wanted to rebuild the Han Chinese identity, and that meant restoring the rituals, the institutions, and the traditions that Mongol rule had interrupted. And somewhere in that restoration, human sacrifice came back with it. When the Hongwu Emperor died in 1398, concubines and attendants were ordered to follow him to the grave. His successor, the Yongle Emperor, the man who built the Forbidden City, continued this practice. When he died in 1424, his women were put on the list to die with him. A later Ming ritual text records that 16 consorts were buried with him at his mausoleum in Chanling. But the Korean records, and we'll get to why the Korean records matter here in just a moment, put the total number of women killed at more than 30. It looks as though the Ming counted titled nobility, whereas the Koreans were counting the bodies. The Ming records are sanitized in their description of this event. The 16 consorts of Chanling are arranged only by number. They have no posthumous titles, no surnames, and no names recorded. All were buried with him. These were women who had spent their years inside of that palace. They built their lives there. And in the end, the official record only gave them a sequence number and ended their lives. At the start of this episode, I promised you a first-hand account. So now's the time to ask ourselves, how did the act actually happen? The Ming sources don't tell you, but the Korean ones do. The women were fed a final meal together in the courtyard. They were then led one by one into a large hall where 30 small wooden stools had been arranged neatly across the floor. Each woman was instructed to step up onto their stool. They were then ordered to place the white silk noose hanging from the beams in front of them around their own necks. Crying in despair and to no avail, before the palace eunuchs kicked the wooden stools out from under their feet with force. The account says that the women's wailing shook the palace buildings. The official Imperial language for this practice translates roughly as, "She gave her life to follow him," as if these women simply chose to drift away silently with their emperor. Now at this point, you might be asking, why is a Korean source the one telling us this information? The Joseon court sent women to the Ming palace as tribute, and that meant Korean women were inside of Yongla's harem. Joseon had its own people to account for, so it kept its records accordingly. And the Ming court had every reason to smooth over the dark details of what happened that day. And that's why the most detailed account of what happened in that hall in 1424 survived in a foreign archive. Of all the women who died that day, there is one whose story the Korean records preserved in enough detail that she finally becomes a person rather than a number. Her name was Han Shu. Her title was Li Fei. She was the daughter of a Korean magistrate, and she was sent to China at 10 years old in 1408 as part of the Korean tribute selection. Harrowingly, she had already actually survived an earlier wave of palace violence in 1421, a purge connected to the deaths of other Korean women in Yongla's harem. While other women were dying by slow slicing, she was instead locked in a room without food or water for days on end, kept barely alive only because a eunuch took pity on her and slipped food through the door. It's devastating to think that she had already lived through one version of this palace's capacity for cruelty before she was put back on the list for round 2, 3 years later. Looking back at it, Li Fei had very little chance of ever leaving the Forbidden City alive. On the day of the executions, the new emperor, Hongxi, Yongla's son, came personally to bid the women farewell before they died. And when he appeared through the doorway, Han Shu wept loudly and begged him, saying, "My mother is old. I wish that she may return to our native country." She'd already accepted her own fate. She was reaching for the only thread that she had left to pull, a plea for her wet nurse, a Korean woman named Kim Hyuk, who had followed her to Beijing as a young girl, and who had been at her side every day since. Then she was taken into that hall. The Joseon annals record what happened next in detail. As Han Shi was about to die, she turned to Kim Hyuk and said, "Mother, I'm leaving. Mother, I'm leaving." But before she had finished speaking, a eunuch beside her kicked out the stand from underneath her, and she died together with Sui Shu, another Korean concubine. That's a fairly haunting ending. Cut off before she had finished speaking, she didn't even get the grace to finish her sentence. And that intimate detail only survived because Kim Hyuk was in that room. She heard it. And eventually, despite the Ming court's best efforts to keep her in China, she went home. The court knew that this was the kind of thing that, if described plainly, would land very badly for them. So they kept the wet nurse captive until enough time had passed that even if the story did come out, there was nothing that could be done about it. Thankfully, this practice of human sacrifice didn't last forever. And how it ended is almost as interesting as how it was revived. It ended in 1464 at the command of the Yingzhong Emperor, a man who had survived something almost no other Chinese emperor ever did. In 1449, during a failed military campaign, he was captured by the Mongols. And he spent a year in captivity, stripped of everything, being kept alive entirely by the decisions of the people around him. When he finally came back, he was a different man. And when he looked at the tradition of killing women to accompany the dead emperors, he issued an edict on his deathbed banning that practice permanently. It was one of the last things he did, and it held for the rest of history. The Qing dynasty kept the ban, but it formalized what came in its place into a rigid, tiered system of lifelong confinement. An empress who survived her husband became the Empress Dowager, and that came with a real residence, real status, and real power. Consorts with sons became dowager consorts. They were still confined, but they were comfortable and dignified in life. But if you were a low-ranking and childless consort, and most women in the imperial harem were, you were moved immediately to the remote sections of the Forbidden City, the North Five Halls, away from court life, away from society, and away from your family. You would have lived in rigid routines with minimal human contact. The looming reality that you would never leave, you would never see your family again. You would grow old there and die there, and that would be the whole of your life after the emperor left. In the end, all of the roads led to the same place. If you entered those palace gates, you never left. So, which reason do you think was the strongest pulling theme over the centuries that kept these practices alive? Was it spiritual, dynastic anxiety, social reframing? Or was it all just really control at its core? And out of all of the twisted fates that we covered today, the sacrifice, the confinement, the forced suicide, and the monasteries, which do you think was the cruelest? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one and would love to hear your thoughts on this. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future videos. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the more you know.